Hi there, and welcome to another episode of the Future of Jewish podcast. I'm your host, Joshua Hoffman. On this episode, I am joined by Noam Wasserman. He is the Dean of Yeshiva University's School of Business. Before becoming Dean in mid-2019, he was a professor of entrepreneurship at Harvard Business School and a chaired professor and founding director of a center at the University of Southern California. Enjoy my conversation with Noam Wasserman. Noam, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me today. As I always say at the beginning of all of my episodes, I'm very excited for this episode, but you're quite unique in the Jewish world in that you're very business focused and you come from a very business oriented background. But before we get into what you're up to today and sort of the business of the Jewish world, if you will, why don't you just give us a peek behind the curtain of your background and everything that led to where you are today?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you so much, Josh, for reaching out. Very much looking forward to chatting with you. Not sure how far back you want me to go, but I grew up in Los Angeles, a very idyllic kind of a childhood. Then the thing that got me out of LA was going to Eretz Yisrael for a year after high school, and then coming back for college. Started college as an engineer, and was diving into a bunch of that curriculum, but also wanted to explore other things that I might be able to match up with that. And at the university I was going to, University of Pennsylvania, there was very much a culture of doing multiple things. And so I dated, among other things, first the combination of computer engineering and psychology, what it would eventually turn into, like artificial intelligence, machine learning, and things like that. Also, one of the programs that they had there was something that was called management and technology. And that was the combination of business at Wharton and also the engineering side. And happened to love that combination, did the two of those. And essentially since then have built on all of that, being able to take both the engineering approach to things, the analytics that you learn, and the way of thinking that breaks problems down, brings process to it, and other things like that, together with the people side, together with understanding the business and the teams and everything else that goes into that. After college, worked in a consulting firm first that did the two of them together. Essentially, not just the front end consulting and then you hand the implementation to people, or that you take the design that someone else did and you implement it, but that you can do both parts of it, that you can do a bunch of the looking at the organization, figuring out what's ill, how you can fix that, how you can redesign the organization or the process around it, then implementing the systems that'll do that, and give me a great feedback loop. Much better than if you just recommend something, you never find out what happened with it. That you can see where is it flawed. You have the iterative element of it. And that's also a little bit of the introduction to the entrepreneurial mindset. Being able to see how you take your first crack at something, you pilot it, you deploy it, you see where it is right, where it is wrong. You work on the wrongs, and over time you iterate and get to something. You go mechayil el chayil. You go from strength to strength by being able to have the iterative process work for you. Along the way, also, excuse me, I got some entrepreneurial experience. I founded what was called the groupware practice. It was a brand new technology that had come out then, be able to facilitate collaboration across people. This is back in the early 90s. And so very early on, pre the internet, pre any of the things that facilitated being able to have multiple people there, saw that as a chance to disrupt consulting. Essentially what would be $5 million projects that we would do, we could do it for $500,000. So a tenth as much and get almost as much of the power out of it. And so built that over 3 years after founding that practice, built it to 19 people. We had a bunch of clients across healthcare and financial and government, like a bunch of diversity in terms of that. After doing that, and this is actually where it intersects with a little bit on the personal side, I would have usually gone back to business school after a couple of years. That's the typical thing. But because we were a dual career couple, my wife is a doctor. She was doing residency at that point. That locked us in for a 5-year period instead. And it's a gamzla tova, all for the best, because I wouldn't have done the entrepreneurial stuff that I was able to. I wouldn't have been able to take on leadership roles and do a lot of other things that have really been some of the seeds that were planted that have now grown into what I've done in the last couple of decades since then. When she finished, after she finished residency, we decided I would go back for my MBA. That's when we came to Boston, thinking it was going to be 2 years to do MBA, and then we'd be back out of town. We would no longer be in Boston. Lo and behold, to skate where the puck is going to be, we've now been in Boston for 26 years. And I've done 3 major career pivots and gone coast to coast, and done a whole bunch of things in the same time that she's been deeply rooted here in Boston, is still working as an OBGYN and heading up the department at MIT Medical. They have an HMO for the campus and things like that. But it's where there's a bunch of the back and forth between your career, her career, how you can maximize the family and the gains that it has and things like that. When we got to Boston, we had our 4th child was on the way. She was born right before my first MBA final. Then along the way, I also worked in venture capital while I was doing my MBA, got some toes in the water in terms of giving me an appreciation for some of the things I had experienced. When we are founders, we typically think that it's just me who's experiencing this, that I'm unique, that I'm the one who's grappling with all of these issues. When I was working in VC, that's when I started realizing that it wasn't just me, that there were recurring issues. There were things that I had faced as a solo founder, as a person building teams, as all the other things that were going into building my practice, that I was seeing recurringly through the founding teams that were coming in the door. And that's when I started realizing that there are regular patterns to it. There are decisions everyone is facing. There are implications for the team and for the venture. And it was then that I got a deeper appreciation of what I had experienced myself years before that. Then when I was in the MBA program, I had a couple of professors who pushed me in the direction of thinking about academia. It was very much the path not taken at that point. I was class of 99 for MBA. This was the .com gold rush. All my classmates were heading out to Silicon Valley. We're going to the heights of the boom, taking advantage of it. And I was having the difficult conversation with my wife, with my parents and everything about why I'm not going to do that, why I'm sentencing myself to walk out the MBA graduation door and in the PhD orientation door. I did some due diligence on what the academic life would be. I collaborated with my main mentor on a project and absolutely loved the intellectual hunt. What things don't we know about the world that we can make some inroads into being able to understand them better? How do we bring data to those questions? How do we analyze it and turn it into new knowledge, create an academic journal paper and other things like that out of it? And just absolutely loved the ability to exercise all of those muscles. And so that's what convinced me to head into the PhD program. During it, I started looking for answers to a bunch of these things entrepreneurially that I had faced, that I had seen in VC. What are the early decisions that founders make that get them in trouble? What are the things that they might be able to do differently because of it? And I found that academia knew almost nothing about them. Academia, I came to appreciate, didn't even know what questions to ask. They were assuming that a startup is just a small version of the Fortune 500, that it's stuff that we can just take our knowledge of, where it's easy to study this, public companies and prominent ones. Let's study CEO issues within them, and then let's just extrapolate down to the small startups, so the CEOs of small startups, when it came to compensation, when it came to succession, when it came to teams and things like that. And I had seen enough to know that some of the patterns not just were irrelevant, but were exactly the opposite of what I had experienced, what I had seen in startups and things like that. And so that was the first of the things, having the firsthand experience to know what questions to ask. The second was how to bring data to it. Private companies, startups, they don't want to open the kimono. They don't want to show you, what they are doing. They don't want to reveal. They don't have to reveal it to the government and file with the SEC and other things like that. And so academia went to public companies to be able to get data and be able to test those types of things. And so I realized, A, I had to bring a bit of my knowledge about what are the dynamics, and B, I would have to go and collect my own data. And so I started collecting the data. The first year of it, I got a little bit more than 200 startups worth of data on all sorts of sensitive issues, all sorts of critical things for us to understand better. The founding team, their backgrounds, how they came together, how long did the founders stick around? When things blew up and a founder left, what was the state of the venture at that point? What did they go through when it came to financing? What did they come to when they were splitting the equity among themselves, when they were deciding on who was going to own what within the venture and things like that? And so took that first set of data, did my first article on taking a look at founder CEO succession, being able to understand how does it happen that a founder gets fired as parent of her baby? What are the things that lead up to it? What are the things that afterwards, how does that affect the venture? And so that was the first foray that I had into that. And then decided to make it an annual exercise in collecting data. And over that first decade, collected 10,000 founders worth of data. This was all focused on the American market. This was focused on two industries, the two biggest industries within the American market, within tech and within life sciences, and was able to do a whole bunch of things, understanding the early decisions founders were making, understanding how they affect team stability, the growth of the venture, the founder's ability to stay as the CEO, a whole bunch of outcome variables around that type of stuff. At the time, I was teaching entrepreneurship at Harvard Business School. That was where I'd taken my faculty position after finishing the PhD program. Ended up developing a course around what my research had shown about the early decisions that founders were making that we should educate them better about. It was a blast to be able to pull that together to found a course, if you will. We called the course Founders Dilemmas, and had a terrific time being able to have that be the testing ground for the ideas, how to convey them to the next generation, the concepts, the case studies, the data, how to bring them all together. And after a couple of rounds of that course, decided to get a little frustrated with only being able to impact a couple of hundred future founders each year firsthand in the classroom. Decided to convert it into a book, be able to bring that knowledge to hopefully thousands of founders out there who could benefit from the knowledge. And so I wrote a book called The Founders Dilemmas that came out almost exactly a decade ago. Came out in 2012. And so all of these ways that I was coalescing all of that knowledge and being able to bring it to the people who could most benefit from it. Ended up staying at Harvard Business School as a faculty member for 13 years. Then got an opportunity to be able to found a center back home in LA. I went back there for a couple of years to start something that we called Founder Central. And it was my chance to be able to go from a solo act into being able to involve a lot of people in the things that we were doing, tap the data, be able to involve a bunch more people and being able to teach the material and add a bunch of other pieces to the puzzle of entrepreneurship education and things like that. And a couple of years into it, that's when Yeshiva University came calling. The president reached out to me, essentially the flagship Jewish university, wanting me to think about taking a dean level role and being able to have an impact on the next generation there. And so that's what I've been doing now for the last 3 years, being able to take the great beginning point that was there. Entrepreneurship was a core part of what YU was trying to do, but being able to make it a lot stronger, being able to upgrade a bunch of the things within the undergrad program, introduce graduate programs, be able to develop continuing education, a whole bunch of things that we can get into a little bit further. But that's probably a little bit more than you want to know about the derech, about the path to it, but it's how it's all coalesced into the academics, the practical knowledge, and being able to bring the next stage of it to the founders who can benefit from it.
I appreciate that. In many cases, they say less is more, but I think in this case, more is less. So I appreciate that well thought out and detailed introduction, as I'm sure my listeners do as well. I want to go back to one of the first things you said, though. You talked about, in consulting, where sometimes you just do the work and pass it off, which we know can be quite ineffective in many cases. And, I wrote an article recently, an essay that I shared with you called The Inconvenient Truths of Jewish Innovation. And in it, I talked about how, in the sort of for-profit world, in the startup world especially, you have R&D, right? Research and development. In the Jewish world, we have a ton of research, but not so much development. And one of the things that I pointed out was that the people that do the research in many cases, including universities like yours, who then pass the research off to other, organizations or other bodies, other groups of people that are therefore sort of responsible for implementing that research, things either get lost between the cracks, so to speak, or, there's, when you do research yourself and then implement it, there's a certain level of like attachment, right? Like it's R&D, it goes hand in hand. Like I talk about in my article, R without D is like the diaspora without Israel. And so like, for example, when I'm doing research for an article, like I'm not just doing it for myself, I'm doing it so that I can develop it into an essay. When I'm doing research for my startup Izzy, I'm not just doing it so, people within Izzy internally can be smarter so that we can develop it and then bring it to market through different products or services. And so I'm just curious, like from your standpoint, first of all, do you agree with that assessment that we have a whole lot of R without the D in the Jewish world? And then if you do, what can we do to ultimately sort of improve the conditions by which we do R&D, and hopefully at some kind of scale.
Yeah, so I think you're talking about across a couple of different worlds. Let's talk first within the world of academia, but also the overarching theme is going to be, and this actually very much applies to starting a podcast around founders' dilemmas right now that I'm doing together with Charlie Harari. Yesterday, the ones that we were recording were about founders having to stick to having the self-awareness about what are their strengths and then being able to hand it off to the people who have the complementary strengths that are going to be able to run with it. So the idea person handing it to the person who can execute and other things like that. It's a rare person. Let's head into the academic realm so that we can make it a little bit more tangible. It's a rare person really who can create the knowledge and then be able to popularize the new knowledge, be able to write the journal article, and then also the big selling book that's going to bring it to the people who can most benefit from it. And so there are some people who are able to spend, their time in their sweet spot, and then hope that there's going to be someone who's gone on the other side. So the academic who comes up with the idea about the 10,000 hours of how you develop expertise, and then the Malcolm Gladwell, who then takes it from there to be able to bring it to all the rest of the world, to be able to popularize it. The ideal is to have someone who can do both. Back to the consulting comparison that you're making. The person who can do the front end, studying the organization, understanding the strategy, and then recommending how it should change. But then a lot of times those people aren't going to have the technical skills, aren't going to have the system development capabilities to be able to implement it, and they have to hand it off. Vice versa also. The techies might not be able to have the business side of it, be able to do that as well. And so either you have to take a portfolio approach, you build a team, or you could have like co-authors, things like that in the academic realm and things like that, where each of you is complementary. And this is where there's actually a lot of comparisons to founding teams. You shouldn't have the two techie team or the two business person team founding an online startup. Being able to I refer to those when I'm talking with my students about it, that's a 2 times 0 team or a 0 times 2 team. You're going to be missing a critical thing and you might end up with 0 because of it. What you have to find is the 1 times 1 team to be able to have all the bases covered that you're going to have with the complementary side. And so when it comes to whether it's research and development, whether it's the academic knowledge creation and the knowledge popularization, other things like that, if you can find people who can do both, terrific. Otherwise, we all might be better off if people are able to develop partnerships, be able to find people who are the complement to them, and then be able to hand things back and forth between the two of them to make that happen. Within business school academia, if you look at the best way to build the faculty, it's to have 2 different types of faculty members. There are the practitioners who are out there, been there, done that, seen it firsthand. They can speak to the phenomenon in the business world and be able to educate students about it. But I remember when I was an undergrad, I took an entrepreneurship course. I only took one because in that entrepreneurship course, the professor was someone who had made his way in the practitioner world. Every day was another story about the tire industry, where he had made his mark and things like that. But the end of the semester, when I'm doing Chazara, when I'm reviewing for the final, I realized that I really had no concepts, no frameworks, no way in which it had shaped things for me beyond a bunch of great stories that I had developed. So there wasn't the conceptual that came together with the practical. Vice versa, you have a bunch of the academics who aren't grounded in the real world. They can't relate their concepts to a bunch of the things that people are going to have to apply within their jobs, are going to be experiencing things like that. So what you want to be able to find is the practitioner who can think conceptually and relate to frameworks. And you want to find the academic who also has grounding in the real world. And if you can bring together a faculty that either has people who can do both, which is a very rare bird, or you can have the two across the portfolio, the practitioner who can relate to the academic and the academic who can relate to the practitioner, that's where you're gonna be able to do both the research and the development, both the knowledge creation and the knowledge dissemination across the two of them. But it's pretty hard to find people who are able to do both of them and do them really well together.
Right, but ultimately, when I'm talking about R&D, I'm talking about, for example, there was a foundation that is funding a 4-year research project about Jewish education in the States. And first of all, 4 years is a long time, but we'll put that aside. So they produce research and then they hand it off to another organization, or they publish it on e-Jewish philanthropy or whatever the distribution method is. And then what? Like, there's no like at IBM here in Israel or Intel or any of the other high-tech companies around the world, R goes with D. It's not research sits in one part of the office and then development is somewhere else or totally outside of the company. And so what I don't understand is like we have so much research in the Jewish world. We have the Pew Research Center. We have tons of studies from YU, from American Jewish University, from Hebrew Union, from universities in Israel. We have organizations that commission their own studies like Birthright and others. And yet, where's the development? Like we know what the problems are. Each study just confirms or suggests that it's getting worse in many cases. Where's the development? And I think that's a rhetorical question. So I'll ask you more specifically.
Well, I can hop in terms of that. I think that with regards to your Jewish education in the States project and things like that, they should be finding schools that are willing to experiment with the ideas that they come up with, partner with them from the beginning, have them be able to also help the research, but be able to have them be involved to the extent that when there's a recommendation that comes out, they can pilot it with them. They can have them be able to take it and run with it. And that's where you get that feedback loop I was talking about before. Deploy something, learn where the concept that they recommended, maybe there are some concepts that aren't grounded, that aren't solid enough. They can learn the Jewish Education in the States project. They can learn a bunch from seeing a pilot, being able to see where they have to work harder on being able to hone the concepts and be able to see where the reality meets. And they would have some pilots out there that are doing the development, that are implementing the project and things like that. So I think the partnership side would be able to work with being able to make that happen better.
Right, but we know that the mainly nonprofit Jewish world is not so keen on partnerships. You know, there's a lot of territorialism and don't tell me what to do, and you stay in your lane and I stay in mine. And I guess what I'm asking you ultimately, which is really the point of my article, the essay, The Inconvenient Truths of Jewish Innovation, is that why don't we have a more robust for-profit or private sector Jewish world? Because ultimately what I believe is that nonprofits, while they're amazing for a lot of things, are not great at moving the needle forward, at creating the kind of social and you know, different types of change that I think a lot of us want to see in the Jewish world. They're maybe good at following, but I don't know if they're very good at leading. The people that are the CEOs and high-level management at many of these organizations are not. I mean, my whole thing is this: I've been very clear. How many CEOs can each of us name at the quote-unquote top Jewish institutions? And the answer is definitely not as much as we can name at Facebook and Tesla and Google and Amazon and so forth. And that's an issue, right? Like if those people are not sort of getting out in front and inspiring the kind of change and then backing it up with the work of the organization, like we see with a lot of examples in the for-profit sector, maybe we've created a Jewish world that is so predominantly nonprofit, and we're asking them to cure a lot of the ills that they have actually created in many ways, not purposely, by the way, incidentally. And so I'm just wondering, like, ultimately, I mean, you're now the head of the business school, and like we have so many bright Jews around the world, in Israel, in the diaspora, in technology and engineering and marketing and product development, et cetera. But these people, by and large, go work for the Facebooks of the world or the Teslas or whatever. And when we look at what exists in the Jewish world, by and large, it's subpar products, subpar services, subpar experiences, not a lot of deep tech. And I'm just wondering, like, why you think that is? Because I think that's a huge issue as we try to, you know, ultimately, I mean, use the term intellectual hunt. Like, I don't see a lot of intellectual hunting in the nonprofit Jewish world. And maybe we shouldn't expect that from them. Maybe that's just not, you know, their core value. But like, there's no alternative. There's no for-profit or private sector. And I guess I'm just curious what you think about all that.
So I think a bit of what you're talking about is having more great people aspire to careers in nonprofit rather than in for-profit. How do we be able to have them?
No, the opposite. I'm saying let's create a for-profit Jewish sector, technology-driven, and create products that can scale, and then take some of the great Jews that might be an engineer at Facebook or a marketer or at Google and say, come over, we're going to pay you the same because we're also a for-profit. We can also pay you and give you stock options and the kind of benefits and perks that have, you know, become accustomed in the high-tech world, at least. I'm saying let's not rely on the Jewish nonprofit sector to be everything to everyone, and instead let's let them do what they're good at in some ways, and then let's create a balance between for-profit and nonprofit in the Jewish world specifically, and attract more talent that can bring better products and services and experiences to the market.
No, I'm all in favor of having for-profit things that are founded to be able to solve social ills and other things like that. I think that there's all sorts of ways in which that kind of bridge we can tell ourselves might be the best of both worlds. We have to avoid it becoming the worst of both worlds. Like, are there ways in which the the things that don't attract people to work in the nonprofit sector are going to mean that is this a solution to that, or is this a doubling down on those problems? Are there ways in which, so I think we can see it not necessarily as is this label as for-profit or nonprofit, because there's a lot of things. Let me take you back to a realization I had about 15 years ago at Harvard. There's the business plan competition that they have in the business school, is very prominent and things like that. They have two tracks within it. They have the for-profit track, and then they have the social track, quote unquote. And I remember taking the list of the company names for each of them, putting them up in front of a bunch of other faculty and saying, categorize each of these 10. They had like 5 finalists in each of them. Categorize each of these 10 about which of these tracks that they're in. They could not tell, because there's a real fuzzy line between the two. You should have every for-profit having a social mission, and you should have every social venture be sustainable. There's going to have to be business principles that come to it. There's going to have to be a business model, even for nonprofits. And so I don't think it's black or white, one or the other, and how we're going to label them as being this is for-profit or nonprofit. Hopefully every company has that social that they're serving. And hopefully every nonprofit is making sure that they're going to be able to stick around more than 5 years, because they've been able to figure out how to get in the right money that's going to make it sustainable and things like that. And so I don't think it's so distinctive across the two of them. How you can get the best of both, I think, is what is the hunt that you're after. How you can have the way in which the social and the for-profit are going to be able to reinforce each other and things like that. I still think that there's some of the career consideration that you're talking about there, about how do we have people aspire to be osek b'tzarchei tzibur? How do we have people who aspire to be able to work on behalf of the general public and things like that? I think, though, there are a bunch of examples of people who have moved from being all-stars within the private sector and moved into the nonprofit sector to lead them. First one who came to mind was Alan Fagan, who was a rock star in the law industry and then came to the Orthodox Union and did some great stuff to be able to lead it to greater heights. The same thing right now that Moshe Bain is doing, coming from, again, law also. Interesting to see that kind of a pattern, but where they were coming later on in their careers. They had learned a whole bunch of things that were applicable to the nonprofit sector. They plowed their kohos, their energies and things like that into being able to do that. How we can foster that within the startups of the nonprofit sector is some of the things that there's some experimentation that's going on right now. The OU itself has something called the Impact Accelerator, where they're trying to find early stage startups that they can be able to foster within YU. We have a project right now that hopefully we're going to be getting off the ground. To be able to have students come up with ideas that are going to be in the nonprofit sector and be able to build them around it. That is twinned with our startup accelerator. It's going to be together with the classic for-profit ones, together with it. Pitch challenge that we have for the students that has both of those things together, the socially oriented companies and the nonprofits that are sustainable coming together within it. And so I don't think we should, and this is part of what you might be saying, we shouldn't be thinking about them as two very distinct things that don't interact. How do we bring them together to be the for-profit that tackles social and vice versa?
Exactly. And that's been my argument for the last 2 years, is each sector brings unique value propositions. And when they coalesce, then you go from a place of, today we know they call it ruinous competition, right, in the Jewish world, and don't compete with me. And, this is my territory and this is my audience. And I'm saying, no, 1 + 1 can equal 3, 4, or 5, which is, not a thought process. And I borrowed that from Ray Dalio, who we know what he's done in his successful career. So, the Jewish world just doesn't understand that. It's very, zero sum and my donors and my audience. And I'm generalizing, of course, there might be exceptions, but I just feel that ultimately, the other thing that I understand about the Jewish world, and maybe you have some thoughts about this as well, is like, to me, there's two groups of nonprofits in the Jewish world. There's what I would call the true charity, which is like hospitals and old age homes and like serving impoverished communities or underprivileged groups of people. That's stuff that should always be done, in my view, in a nonprofit way. I mean, I'm not comfortable sort of capitalizing on that kind of thing. But then there's the second group, which is what I would call experiential. And those are like everything from, trips to Israel to, different types of communities and events and, content and entertainment, even education, I would put under that. And some of that potentially should stay nonprofit. But I think when you look at like many of the equivalents of like tourism or different types of events outside of the Jewish world, like it's in many cases, it's done in the private sector. And it's done because when you, like, this is what to me just boggles my mind. When you approach something and say, I have to bring a product to the market that they're willing to pay for and they're willing to spend their time and money and their attention on, then that's a whole different mindset than a small group of donors is paying me to put on this event. And so I really have to appease the donors as opposed to making sure that the 100 or 2,000 or 10,000 people that show up not only have an exceptional experience, but then say, I'm not only coming back next year or during the next iteration, but I'm also going to tell all my family and friends to come with me. And like, that's the issue in the for-profit world. The investor, which is the donor in the nonprofit, the investor and the end consumer are on the same line. What's good for the customer is good for the investor and vice versa. But in the nonprofit world, we know that we have a lot of donors that want X, and a lot of times X doesn't equal Y, which is what the market wants, or maybe a small part of the market wants X, but a large part of the market wants Y or Y plus X. And so that creates that mismatch. And then we end up, with a lack of product market fit. And ultimately people, we see the results of this. People less interested in their Judaism and being Jewish and doing Jewish. We know the quote unquote just Jewish community in the States. By the way, also in Israel, amongst younger generations in Israel, my generation and younger, same sort of trends. People are not finding themselves in Judaism. They're not seeing themselves reflected in Judaism. And I'm saying that's a bummer because actually Judaism has so much to offer so many different groups of people, religious, not religious, Israeli, American, etc. But the nonprofit world has really not been able to deliver Judaism in ways that are relevant and interesting and compounding to enough people so that a lot of the trends that I know you're probably even more familiar with than I am at YU, we can not just combat them, but turn them around and go in a completely different direction where we say, wow, Jewish people are not just surviving, we're thriving. And not just amongst Jews, but amongst the, what I call our non-Jewish family, friends, and communities, people that are saying, wow, I wish I was Jewish. I would love to tap into the Jewish culture or Jewish wisdom or Jewish spirituality or whatever it may be, because I can, even though I'm not Jewish and I'm not living a Jewish life, there's different things that I can take, just like I take things from Buddhism or I take things from the African-American culture. And so I just feel that to me, like, and that's one of my questions, I guess, is like, how much of your business school at YU is like just basically saying, here's business 101, so to speak, and like go apply it however you want, versus saying like, no, how do we take like business and then apply it to the Jewish world? Like, do you guys differentiate there? Is it one or the other? How does that work?
No, we have Jewish values suffused across the business school, suffused really across the university, like a fundamental thing. I mean, we got a new president 5 years ago, and the key thing that he has been driving at every level, and we've been able to make the business school into, if anything, a paragon of it, is having everything that we do all be informed by the Jewish values and drive those home. So, for instance, there was a quote recently that I saw in one of the newsletters. It was one of the Torah newsletters, but it was a student. They were asking him, what do you like about YU? And he talked about Syms, the business school. What does he like about it? That even in my finance and accounting classes, the professors are talking to us about Jewish values, the integrity in what we're doing as a professional, the ways in which we have to be able to bring that into the workplace. We have a curriculum that everyone's required to take. That's called the Jewish Values Curriculum, where they're learning about how to be able to excel as a professional in the workplace and in the community. This actually goes to some of the things we talked about earlier. In the workplace, There's a bunch of the things about the challenges you're going to face and how to be better prepared for them. And that way you're going to be able to keep your values and be able to maintain them. In the community, we have a course that's called Jewish Public Policy. Having people, the YU grads are going to be the ones who are leading the communities. They are the boards of director, chairman, they are the heads of school. There are other things like that who are changing like the face of a bunch of those nonprofits that you're talking about within there. How do we have people be prepared to think at a communal level? How do we have them think at a policy level, at the dynamics within the community, other things like that? And so that's within the undergrad. We have it suffused across a bunch of the, what you would call secular classes, but where there was one student last week who was praising me about one of the ace finance professors that we have, who ends every class with a Dvar Torah that's relevant to the things that they were doing that day in class. A bunch of the talks that I give, we call them Torah U Entrepreneurship. How do we bring the Jewish mindset and the entrepreneurial mindset to all the things that we do? Being able to think about how we get stronger from both of them together. Not that there is the entrepreneur side of us and the Torah side of us, and never the twain shall they meet. We are more distinctive and more are able to have a deeper impact if we are able to build on both sides of us. And so within the business school, we do that. That's very much within the undergrad side, where it's like all Jews within there. But even within the graduate programs right now, we are developing a bunch of things in our new MBA program that are Jewish values elements. We have within our leadership course, my predecessor as dean is one of the world experts on Jewish business ethics. Within the leadership course, we had him develop a piece of it so that when the students are learning leadership and making leadership decisions, they're thinking with Jewish values and integrity. The same thing in accounting, the same thing in marketing, the same thing in all of these, being able to have them look through the Jewish lens at all of these professional dimensions and being able to bring it into there. That's within the grad programs that have a whole bunch of non-Jews in there, but who are coming to us because they believe that, just as you were saying, that a lot of non-Jews can benefit from the ancient wisdom of 3 millennia, being able to take a lot of that and suffuse that into how they make decisions in the modern world, how they can be deeply grounded in our tradition and in our the best practices we've developed over those millennia, but also forward focused on changing the world through innovation, through entrepreneurship, and all the other things that they're going to be doing.
Right, but like, let's say I'm a student, at either the undergrad or the grad school, a business student. I'm saying, listen, like, I just learned a bunch of great business practices and knowledge and all that good stuff, plus the Jewish values, and I want to like contribute to the Jewish people, but my only option right now is to go work for a nonprofit. So I have a business degree, but now I have because that's where the mismatch takes place, right? Like, and that's where I think we lose a huge group of people. I think I'm the exception, like me being an entrepreneur that's channeling my entrepreneurship through the Jewish prism, so to speak, in the Jewish world. Like that's, I mean, I'm not saying I'm the only one. I think there are other people out there. I mean, when you actually look at, because I went back and looked for my essay that I wrote about Jewish innovation or the lack thereof, like there actually has been two, what I would call real innovation. And I describe in my essay, what is real innovation? Number one, it has impressive scale. Number two, widespread consumer adoption. And number three, ongoing engagement. So I think a lot of the Jewish nonprofits like Chabad or Taglit, they check two of those three boxes, but they don't check all three. So I wouldn't call them real innovation. And that's my definition. People can have their different definitions of that. But my whole thing is like, when you actually look at the two examples of real innovation in the Jewish world in the last 20, 30 years, you had J-Date in the late 1990s, and then you had J-Swipe in 2014. Those were both for-profit companies that were coincidentally acquired by the same larger company that has nothing to do with Judaism called Spark Networks. But like, is your school like encouraging or training somehow business students to go and create startups in and for the Jewish world? Or are you just saying, here are the Jewish values, if you want to go apply them at Facebook, do that. If you want to go work at a Jewish nonprofit, good luck. Like that's what I'm trying to understand.
No, it's our students go in all of those directions. I don't know that I would tell them to go right out of a school and found almost anything, let alone something that's going to require a lot of knowledge of the Jewish landscape and other things like that they won't have necessarily. I would tell them to work on the way to that goal and be able to coalesce a bunch of other experiences, practical real world experience on the way to that, connections and other things like that. But we have students who are, let's back up a little bit. We have students who are experiencing the nonprofit world right now. We're actually ramping up. It's the third year of it right now, something we call the YU Consulting Force. They are doing projects for nonprofits in the Jewish world to help those nonprofits. We teach them consulting skills. We teach them a bunch of other skills that they then apply in these internships that they do for them. We also have, as part of it, some for-profit companies that they are doing some internships for within the consulting force. And so there are a bunch who are already doing that. Some of them by experiencing what it is to be Osek B'Tzarchei Tzibur, what it is to contribute to the nonprofit or the socially oriented world, change their career plan that sector. Some of them, it's to become executive directors of existing organizations. Some of it is to eventually found things in the way that you're talking about. That's just one example of where YU students are getting their toes in the water. They're experiencing how to be able to think in a for-profit way, but be able to have a social mission to it and things like that. And so it's a very broad range in which how students are being able to do that. It could be they're going to the Facebook and they're bringing values to it and the entrepreneurial thinking that we teach them, and then 5 years into it, then they are heading into being able to do their own thing that's going to be more in the line of what you're talking about, or they're heading more directly into it. We have a course that is taught by a YU grad, actually used to be the head of research for the OU, and he teaches them, it's called Nonprofits version 2.0. Is to have them understand the best practices around creating the social organizations. Some of them could end up being for-profit. Some of them could end up being nonprofit, but it's taking the same approach to being able to understand the social pain that's out there, how we bring our talents to be able to have a solution to it, create an organization around it that could scale, a bunch of the other things that you're doing. And so between the courses, between the summer experiences, between the building the knowledge on both the for-profit and nonprofit side, yeah, there's a whole bunch of YU students who are going to be the ones who are going to shape the version 2.0 of nonprofit world.
So I want to get to, you mentioned data, which is, I think we have like surface level data in the Jewish world, but we don't have like true zero first party deep data. And I think that's one of the issues with, again, the nonprofit world is like, I don't know if they have the people that understand like data science, or if they do, maybe they don't have the funds, or there's always, in the nonprofit world, there's always an excuse for why they're not doing more stuff. And sometimes it's legitimate, but other times it's an excuse. And I'm just curious, like, wouldn't it make sense for us to like do a better job of not just data collection, like deep data collection in the Jewish world, but then sharing that, right? Again, like we go like in the for-profit world, we know that like two businesses can come together because 1 + 1 = 3, and that's great for the bottom line, among other things. But again, I go back to the Jewish nonprofit world, and all I know is like, okay, you have Birthright, which has like a certain amount of data, but they don't make that available to like YU, and YU doesn't maybe make it available to American Jewish University, and so on and so forth. And like, isn't that actually hurting more than helping the Jewish cause when we're not only harvesting that deep data, but then sharing it and making it available to as many people as possible to do, better work, data-driven work?
No, the data can always be very powerful, as we already talked about. Like, it was critical for my being able to make inroads into the founders' dilemmas and other things like that. Let's go back to one of the things that we talked about. I think there are some examples of it where there have been some initial inroads. The person I mentioned who teaches our version 2.0 of nonprofits course, his name is Matt Williams. As head of research for the OU, he was bringing a bunch of the best practices around how you do surveys, a bunch of things that he had learned from, in academia about how to be able to collect data and other things like that. And he put out a series of white papers on it. He did a fireside chat with our students when they had the OU's data collection and how COVID was affecting the Orthodox community. And so a bunch of the ways in which there have been some of those efforts. Right now, YU is working on a data exploration of being able to see how it might be able to become a driver of some of that. What are the needs within it? What are the ways to be able to do it? It's still the early days of it, but I think some of those elements coming together are being able to have the best practices that people have learned about how to do surveys within academia. Then once you collect that data, you're doing your own analytics on it, but also seeing, are there people who also might be able to benefit elsewhere from it? So I think there's some initial forays into it, but yeah, as we talked about, even within business research that didn't exist for private companies, nonprofits are private companies, essentially. There's nothing that's requiring them to reveal stuff and things like that. And so the same way that I had to make inroads 20 years ago, there's some people who are initially doing that type of stuff, Matt and others, to make sure that it's going to be data-driven decisions that are being made, rather than the same kind of thing within entrepreneurship, where it was just gut and instinct that was driving what to found and how to found it and things like that.
I want to go back to my remarks about the lack of product market fit in the Jewish nonprofit world. Assuming that you agree with that to an extent, at least, I mean, what would you say how we can do a better job of achieving that product market fit, and again at scale, not just for a small community here or there?
Well, I don't think it's Jewish nonprofits that face that. I think it's nonprofits in general. There's a bunch of academic research that's been done on a variety of nonprofits that started up to fill a pain. Then when the pain went away, it was no longer there, the nonprofits still kept going. Because the last thing you want to do is shut down your organization. The last thing a founder could do is say that I'm no longer needed and stuff like that. And they stick around for a long time beyond when the need is there. So I don't think it's necessarily a Jewish nonprofit problem. I think it's a general thing about going beyond your mission and being able to tune into that mission, things like that. Some of the things that you were talking about before, we can think about the disconnect. I don't know enough about where you're coming from in terms of that, but that the donors don't have the same interest in in what the people who are out there. Hopefully the donors are going to be aware that their money is not having the impact that they could have otherwise, because it is not hitting the market. Hopefully when we see a request for proposals from nonprofits, foundations for us to pitch them projects, things like that, it's a key thing they're looking at to make sure we're going to have the impact with the money, that there is a need in the market for it, that there's going to be enough people who are going to be using whatever service it is or other things like that. And so it definitely seemed to be trying to make sure that it's going to be happening, but how you might be able to tighten those up, be able to have it not be a 10-year cycle for it to show up that it's not product market fit, be able to have that turn into a 3-year cycle instead, where the feedback loop is going to be sooner. That might be some of the things that would have to be shored up by those foundations and stuff.
But isn't it a little bit of a bait and switch? Because if you're the head of a nonprofit that has been doing X for whatever, 10 years or longer, and I mean, let's be honest, let's call it what it is now. I mean, the vast majority of these organizations are reporting vanity metrics to the donors. So think about it. It's okay, I'm the CEO, and all I know is that this guy's going to write me another check, or this woman's going to write me another check, or this foundation, as long as I show them good numbers. And so you're saying, well, donors want their money to have impact, but if I, as the organization, come to them and say, no, look, we are making an impact. These are the numbers. We're getting, this million views on YouTube, and we're, reaching this many people here. Then a lot of organization executives, I don't think have the courage to stand up and say, you know what, we're not doing the kind of thing we need to be doing. We're not getting that quote unquote ROI that we should be getting with your money. And here's a pivot. And here's where we feel that even though we were started for XYZ reason, as you said, that's been cured, and we did our job, and so now we need to pivot, and now we need to create impact here, and so that's what this is going to look like, and we want you to fund that. That's a lot harder and more courageous thing to do than to just say, no, actually, this thing that you've been giving us money for the last 5 or 10 years, even though we don't really need to be doing it that much anymore, keep giving us that money, because we'll just keep showing you some vanity metrics to suggest that we're kind of still making the impact that, I mean, that to me is where I see a lot of the gap, is that unless the organizations are willing to stand up and say, we're going to do something different and risk losing that donor, there's no incentive. And again, in the for-profit world, it's so obvious that what's good for the investor is good for the customer. If you're not reaching enough of a critical mass of customers, the investor is not going to be happy. Therefore, it's your job. If you have to pivot 10 times, you pivot 10 times. If you have to develop other audience segments, you develop whatever you have to do to create impact in the for-profit world, you do it, and the investor supports it because it's good for his bank account. In the nonprofit world, it seems like it's almost the exact opposite. And that's something that I can't understand why more people are not talking about, including somebody like yourself, who has the tremendous knowledge and experience on the business side, to come in and say, okay, maybe the nonprofits can't do what we need them to do in many cases. Things around technology, you talked about data and artificial intelligence, machine learning. maybe we, including your university, can step up and say, we are going to make sure that the Jewish for-profit world has the amount of funds and resources that the nonprofit world has, so that we can help each other ultimately get to where we all want to go.
So I think the vast majority of donors that I have engaged with, that I want to find and things like that, they're not the wallflowers that you're talking about. They're not able to be convinced by surface things that are just, metrics that don't tie into their mission, their impact, and things like that. They're looking for real assurances that this is going to have, that if I'm giving you this money, that you're going to come through on it. I don't think they're the pushovers that, at least the ones that I have seen and that I try to work with, that you're talking about within there. I think that there are lots of ways in which there is more alignment between them, but there's the same as we talked about, like within nonprofits, there's a chance there's going to be misalignment. When you were talking about within like the business sector, .com boom, how did that happen? Because the investors were looking at eyeballs. That's not an indicator of, that's going to have the profits coming in. So even there, you're going to have disconnects if the investors aren't pushing for the right things or aren't, making sure that the impact is going to be there. So I think that there is more of it going on within there. If you're talking about the for-profits, how do they get more money, and that the investors are aligned in for-profits with what the customers need out there, that should happen a lot better if the organization is tuning into the customers. It should be easier for you to make the argument that investors, you should give us money because we are hitting the customer market, if the customers and the investors are aligned within for-profits. And so if anything, it should make it easier, the pursuit that you have, your passion for being able to create those for-profits that are doing social stuff. If you're right about the alignment being better there, that should make it easier for you to find those people to give you money than it is for the nonprofits who are trying to argue to the donors about impact, which is harder to measure, and other things like that, that are going to not be as aligned as it's going to be between investors and customers.
Last question for you. You mentioned your first book, The Founder's Dilemma, but your second book, I think, is incredibly applicable, not just to sort of entrepreneurs in the world, but really anyone. It's called Life as a Startup. And I just think this was a tremendous book, very on point. Read some excerpts that I found online and just very much connected, obviously being a founder myself and starting now 2 startups. I have a little bit of bias here, but I would say anyone can, really understand the inner workings of a startup and then apply that to their life. I think, you talk about whether you're an employee or, what have you. So why don't you just tell us a little bit about what drove you to write that book and what you want people to get out of it?
No, absolutely. They appreciate that. That was useful for you. So there's actually in the Talmud, there's an excerpt that's become relatively famous. It's in the volume that's called Tanit. It's on the 7th page of it. There's someone named Rabbi Hanina. And he says that I learned a bunch from my teachers, I learned more from my colleagues, and I learned the most from my students. And the origin of that book is a perfect example of what Rabbi Hanina was talking about. I had been focused, as we talked about, for that first decade, totally on founders. Every academic paper I wrote had to have founder in the title. The course I developed, Founder's Dilemmas, the book I wrote, the founder was everywhere. I had a student come by the second year of the course at Harvard. It was in 2010. And typical like office hour that he's coming by to chat. This is one of the delightful things that I love about both academia, like the professor, and also as a dean, being able to chat with the students about what's top of mind for them. Usually it would be students coming to me with their founding dilemmas or career decisions and things like that. This student came down, sat down across from me, and he said, Noam, I'm, in terms of like my career direction and things like that, I'm taking founders dilemmas, but I'm never going to be a founder. And so I was like, okay, well, I was about to apologize to him for snookering him into taking the wrong course. Like, this is not going to be a building block for you. He said, but despite that, it has completely changed my marriage. And I was like, where's he coming from? That's not what I'm teaching. We never touch on personal issues. We don't, in terms of marital types of things. This is not a counseling class or anything like that. So I didn't understand where he's coming from. I saw it as my chance to be able to learn from my student and be able to do what Rabbi Hanina did. I essentially said, David, tell me more about this. Where are you coming from? And he said that I'm a newlywed and I found my co-founder of life. And we've been struggling with a bunch of things together as we craft this new stage of life. How do we make decisions collectively at this key inflection point as we're changing careers and going on from grad school? How do we even allocate the roles within the family? You said essentially the equivalent of we try to split things up pretty equally where I'm cooking one night and she's cleaning that night, and then vice versa the next night. And what we're finding is that the food is really bad half the time, and the apartment is really dirty half the time. And now we're seeing in class how our founding teams are grappling with the same thing with their real co-founders, not the co-founders of life, and how they're allocating roles, how they're not so focused on everything being exactly equal, how they're making collective decisions together. Also, how they get past the difficult conversations. You would walk in at night and would say, honey, we had to do a negotiation exercise today to build our difficult conversation muscles. Let's try that out here at home because we've been avoiding some conversations and things like that. And so he was essentially importing a lot of the best practices, a lot of the skills, a lot of the entrepreneurial mindset into his couplehood. And so that was the thing that the realization for me that life is a startup. Like we're all taking a bunch of new things that we have not ventured into. What are the things that we can learn from the entrepreneurial best practices that I developed over the decade before that? And how can we import that into our personal relationships, into the large company teams that we might work in as employees and other things like that, making career decisions? How do founders make the decision to leap into the unknown when they have a lot of uncertainty around being able to do it? How do we be able to create a safety net for our career, but be able to take risks and other things like that? And so all of those are a bunch of the things that over the next 5 years after David had put it on my radar, I was developing a bunch of the application, watching for a bunch of them, some of the ways which I was applying it, the discussions I was having with my alumni and things like that. And so that's what coalesced into Life as a Startup. And since then, if anything, most of what I've been doing is a lot more in that arena. How to be able to, and we talked about already, how to be able to do the Torah plus entrepreneurship stuff. How do we bring the entrepreneurial thinking? How do we bring the Torah concepts together in our lives to be able to make it a richer experience and a more impactful thing that we can do?
Noam, this has been a really inspiring podcast episode. So thank you so much for taking the time, and I wish you the best of luck.
No, same to you, Josh. May you continue to change the world in all the dimensions that you're trying to do it. And may we all be able to join you someday in Eretz Yisrael.